Christina, do you want to throw out a few ideas from that and from your own work?
Certainly, I've got 7 minutes, right? Or
Ish.
Less. So at CAFOD, we've also been looking with concern at the same context of a growth agenda that's not really delivering in terms of tackling inequality, and a poverty reduction agenda that's become too divorced from that sort of macroeconomic agenda. And the lack of focus at the links and the interactions between the two, things that we've already heard about from both speakers, such as employment and tackling inequality and the social dimension of growth, and patterns of growth. But rather than make sort of a high-level analysis, we started at the other end in talking to our partners and the beneficiaries of our projects on what was their experience of not growth, because that's quite an abstract concept for them, as is poverty to a certain extent. But what is it that they're looking for? What is it that we can do in terms of improving their interactions with markets, with growth, to help contribute to poverty reduction? And as Claire mentioned in her introduction, the big response that we got was jobs and employment. So we started with looking at sort of where are the jobs, and how do we increase the number of jobs, and how do we make them better quality jobs, as Naila was saying. And we came to the conclusion that the biggest area of neglect was the small-scale sector. This is where the majority of jobs were. Only 4% of jobs are in TNCs. Even in OECD countries, not many of the jobs are in larger firms, they're mostly in small firms. And they're largely, as Naila was saying, in the informal sector, largely in the rural economy, and these have been really neglected in growth strategies, partly because we don't count them as a contribution towards growth figures, and partly as we don't consider them proper jobs. They're not seen as sustained routes out of poverty, they're not seen as economic activities that will lead to structural change, as was mentioned in the first presentation. But we sort of questioned these assumptions and looked at what you could do to improve the contribution of the small-scale sector. And we came to some very similar conclusions as we heard from these two speakers. The first, that there needs to be more focus specifically on them, on the kinds of interventions that are needed, as you mentioned, sort of getting the product to the market, looking at the regulatory barriers to these firms in particular, and also directing spending towards this sector. We found that only a very small proportion of aid for trade, for example, goes on the small-scale sector. It's massively ignored, largely by donors up until now. And the other conclusion that we came to is that we need to sort of abandon the usual approach to growth and poverty. It's not business as usual. It's not sort of the making markets working for the poor usual approach of just inserting people into your current model. It's more what we heard about from Sarah, looking at something that's more comprehensive, and as we heard from Naila, more unorthodox. So looking at not just creating jobs, but looking at human development, like health of the workforce and of the sort of often sole trader, sole entrepreneur, was one of the major concerns that was raised when we talked to the beneficiaries of our projects. Also looking at the political power of these groups. Some of the most successful projects that we had were to do with organising people into farmers' cooperatives so that they get more of a say on the economic policy agenda, whether at a local level or national level, or even in their interactions with CAFOD and our partners. And also to look at the social side of things, as we heard quite a lot in the first presentation. It's not just the individuals, you've got to look at the community, you've got to look at the household and how all those different interactions come together. You can't just look at the job or the employment or the livelihood in isolation. And finally, sort of the need to reassert the role of the state, the need to be more interventionist, to allow the states to have the resources, but also the freedom to look at the sector. We were looking specifically at the sort of investment climate advice that goes to developing country governments. is largely based on sort of urban, formal and medium-sized enterprises, not very much at all to do with the kind of enterprises being set up by poor people. So in a post-MDG agenda, which I think was what we're meant to be looking at, there is this first lesson of substance, looking at not separating the two, not looking at separating growth and poverty, but looking much more at the links and interactions, looking at employment, looking at inequality, looking at the social dimension of economic policies, but also not just looking at sort of targets and aspirations, which is what the MDGs largely were, but looking at commitments and responsibilities, what will the local governments do in order to create jobs, create the right environment for the small-scale sector to flourish, and what are the donors going to do and not do in order to assist them with that.